All right, say good evening. Let us begin. So we are picking up Emirat Hashem tonight at the Mishnah on Nun Amud Aleph, the Mishnah on 50a. So the Mishnah says as follows: Shlosh Shachos. We're still continuing a little bit in the Halachos HaMezumin, a really interesting Gemara. Shlosha she'achlu ka'achos. 3 people ate together as a group. So the Gemara says, Ein rashayin lichalek. So they are not permitted to separate one from the other. In other words, so let's say, again, Reuven, Shimon, and Levi are eating a meal together. They washed. So they can't separate before benching. Because obviously, what happens if they separate before benching? You lose out on the opportunity for a mezumin. Okay? V'chein arba, v'chein chamisha. Now, that's not just the din in 3. That's a din of 3, 4, and 5. However, again, once we get to Shisha, once you get to 6 people, then Nechlok ad Asara. Then 6, essentially between 6 and 9, you could go ahead and split up. Between 6 and 9, right? Because remember again, between 6 and 9, whether you're 2 groups of 3, 3 groups of 3, so that's irrelevant. Up until you get to 10. Because once you get to 10, then you have a minyan, right? Obviously, as we've established right in the last sugya, once you're davening with a minyan, then halacha l'maisa you could say Elokeinu, right? So everything changes. So you can't break up a group. V'asara einech lokin achu esrim. 10 can split up until they're 20. So once you have 10, the problem is anytime you split a group of 10, you're going to have less than 10, obviously. Right? So a group of 10 can't split up until you reach 20, because at 20, then you could divide it to 2 groups of 10. Okay, next. So this is another interesting case. Two groups were eating in one home. So we'll say, what's the halacha? Now, the Gemara says, so just if you could imagine, the way this works is, so imagine, it doesn't have to be a home. Just like imagine you're in like a hall, right? And there are 2 groups that are eating. One group is eating on one side of the hall, another group is eating on the other side of the hall. So now, obviously now what's going to be the shaila? The shaila is, can they combine to form a unit for benching? So the Gemara says it depends. Bizman shemitzas ro and elu es elu, hare elu mitztarfin lezimun. If the 2 groups have the ability to see each other, right? So in other words, if there is ocular connection, I know it's here for mincha. I think they're going to daven mincha in the side rooms in the base medrash. So we'll say so if the groups are able to see each other, then that range of vision connects them. Now, by the way, that's not. So in other words, so let's say, for example, let's say you go ahead and you have 2 groups of 5, right? One's eating on one side of the hall, other one's eating on the other side, but they see each other. That could become a group of 10 for benching, even though what? They didn't eat together. So that ocular connection, that visual connection allows them to become a group. By the way, where else do you see this halacha? Where else do you see it? Minyan. You know, for the first time in my life, where this ever came up? By COVID. Right? By COVID, especially during that period of time when we started to move davening inside, not everybody was comfortable necessarily with davening inside. So you had people inside, you had people outside. So this halacha of, if as long as people are able to see each other, then they could create that visual connection creates a group connection. So fascinating. Okay. But if the 2 groups can't see each other, in other words, let's say they're both eating a meal in the same building, but they're in 2 different rooms and they can't see each other, then the halacha is elo mezanin liatzman ve'elo mezanin liatzman. Then each group ultimately again goes ahead and eats on its own, or I should say benches on its own. Okay, ein mevarchen al yayin. This is another interesting halacha. You can't make a bracha on wine ad sheyitin lesocho mayim divrei Rabbi Eliezer. So this is interesting. Rabbi Eliezer says that you can't go ahead and drink wine until you dilute it. Now, what's the pshas? You have to understand something. So, in the times of the Gemara, when you bought wine, what were you buying? You were buying wine concentrate. You bought wine concentrate. In fact, the Gemara says, the Gemara tells us that their historical dilution ratios were 3 parts water to 1 part wine. That was how strong the what was the word? Concentrate. Thank you. Concentrate. So this, interestingly enough, Rabbi Eliezer says you can't make a bracha on wine. You can't make a bracha on wine up until the point that you dilute it. There has to be a dilution. Only once there's a dilution, then halacha l'maisa, you go ahead and you can make a bracha on it. And we'll say now the logic behind that is because wine concentrate isn't really considered to be consumption worthy. So therefore, in general, you're not going to make a bracha, or at least a regular bracha, on something that's not consumption worthy. The Chum say no, that halacha l'maisa, you make the bracha. you make the bracha. Even on the concentrate, even if it's not diluted, you still make the bracha. All right, incredible. So we'll say, so now let's analyze. Now let's focus on the first part of the Mishnah. So the first part of the Mishnah said that when three people eat together as one, when three people eat together as a group, then halacha l'maisa, they can't disperse, right? They can't separate, because again, if they're eating together as a group of three, they have the opportunity for mezumin. But the problem is if they split up, that opportunity for mezumin evaporates. So the Gemara says, "My kamash malan." So I don't understand, like, what's the chiddush over here? Tanina chadazimna. We already learned this once. Where did we learn this? Gimel sha'achlu ka'achos chayavan lezamin. This is a very interesting case. If three people, as we said before, if three people eat together, they're obligated to make a mezumin. They're obligated to make a mezumin. So the Gemara says, how come? So in other words, we've already learned that if three people eat together, they have to make a mezumin. So if that's the case, then what's the chiddush? Then what is the Mishnah coming to teach me? To which the Gemara says, Hakamash Malan. So the Gemara gives us three. It's actually very interesting. Three possibilities of new halachas that maybe we could learn from the Mishnah. So number one, Kihad Amar Rabbi Amar Shmuel, Gimel sheyashvu le'achol ka'achos. Va'adayin lo achlu. Listen to this case, Rabbi say. Now, the literal translation is a little bit misleading as to what the case actually means, because the way it literally translates is three people sit down to eat together as one unit. Va'adayin lo achlu. They did not yet eat. Ein rasha'in lichalik. They can't separate from each other. So I'll say, so what does this mean? Three people sit down together, they didn't yet eat, they can't separate from each other. It doesn't seem to make much sense if they didn't eat. So what's the shaila? So the way Rashi and the first one understand it is as follows. Three people sat down and they made hamotzi together. But they didn't yet begin the meal. So therefore the Gemara is telling me, once you make hamotzi together, even though again you haven't eaten a kizayis of bread and you haven't begun your meal, all you did was simply make a hamotzi together, that essentially solidifies the group dynamic of a zimun, and once that happens, you can't break away from the group without benching. Right now, you could bench and leave, or you could bench that you could do, but Lamaisa, so it's interesting. In other words, I would have thought that maybe the zimun, the mezumin cohort is only created and concretized once the meal itself is consumed. Kamash Mala, no. Once they make hamotzi and take a bite of bread together, that's it. That is a solidified group. And then the halach of the Mishnah, that you can't break apart from each other until you bench, that goes into effect. Very interesting. Lishnachri, now another possibility. So three people sit down to eat together. So we'll say this is very interesting. I might have thought that when do three people sitting down together create a mezumin? When? Not just simply when they eat together, but when they eat of the same food together. When they actually share their food together. That's what creates a mezumin. But let's say again, three people sit down, right? Again, I brought my lunch from my house. Ruvain brought his lunch. Shimon brought his lunch. We just all happened to be sitting down eating our own lunches. We're just sitting together, but we're not sharing food. I might have thought that maybe that does not create a mezumin cohort. Kamash Malon, it does. It does. You need not be sharing food in order to create the mezumin. Very interesting. So the Gemara says, Inami, another possibility is, so these are all different halachas that we learn from the Mishnah. Inami, Kiha Dravhuna Da Amaravhuna, listen to this. Gimel Sheba'o Me Gimel Chaburos. This is very interesting. Eino Rasha'in Lichalek. Listen to this. Let's say you have three people who came from three different groups. So let me illustrate the case. You have Ruvain, Shimon, and Levi. Right? Ruvain, Shimon, and Levi are each having their own meals with their own groups. Reuven and Shimon and Levi now break away from their groups and come together. So Rav Huna says like this, that's three people, Reuven, Shimon, and Levi, who were initially part of their own three-man groups, right? Broke apart from their groups. Einon Rashan Lachalik. Once those three come together, they have to bench together. They have to bench together as a mezumin. Now, let's analyze this. Amar Rav Chisda. Let's qualify this ruling a little bit. So Rav Chisda is number one. V'hu sheba'u megimel chaburos shel gimel b'nei adam. So first of all, again, this is assuming over here that halacha l'maisa, each of these individuals came from a mezumin. In other words, they each came from a group of three. So they started in a group where there was an obligation for a mezumin. Now they broke away from their respective groups. They came together. Now, because they came from a group of that had an obligation of a mezumin, they kind of carry that obligation with them. And now when they come together, they bench b'mezumin as well. Okay. Amar Rava. So Rava says, 1 second. Let's qualify that a little bit more. No base, 50b. V'lo amran ella delo akdimu hanach va'azman alay b'dichtayu. Aval azman alay b'dichtayu paruch zimun minaya. So we'll say this is very interesting. Furthermore, another qualification. When is it so that if Reuven, Shimon, and Levi break away from their own groups and come together, that they could form a mezumin group? When is that true? So we'll say, essentially what that halacha is saying is like this. Once you're part of a zimun, of a zimun group, 3 or more, the obligation to bench with a mezumin is upon you, to the point that even if you leave the group and get together with 2 other guys, right, everybody's carrying their own mezumin obligation with them, and therefore they bench with them as a mezumin as a group.
Even though they messed over the other groups. Yeah.
Even though they messed over the other groups, correct. Right. Again, we're not encouraging this, right? It's certainly not nice, but yes, technically speaking, even though now that they left, now the truth is, which is an interesting discussion in general about whether or not the mezumin has to be there at the time of benching, or is it just enough that the mezumin was there at the time that you began the meal? So again, we pass the mezumin has to be there at the time of benching, but that's what we say it's machlokes as well.
It's not a mitzvah. It's not a mitzvah about Berachos. It's almost like they did something. They caused others not to be able to
correct.
We're still going to allow
correct. Now remember, you could insert whatever narrative you wanted to this. Also, Reuven and Shimon Levi could have had very good reasons for why they had to run out. For whatever. So in other words, we don't have to ascribe to this malicious intent. But they're messing other people over. But the interesting part is essentially once you are part of a group that has an obligation to bench as a mezumin, that obligation goes with you. So that now 3 guys from 3 groups join together, then halacha said they have to bench a mezumin, even though they may be messing over their former groups 100%. Now,
supposed to go back to where they
ideally, this is all presupposing that they left and they're not going back.
Can you do it twice? Can you go back to the
other? So no, watch this. So watch this. See, here's the difference. So remember, so comes along Rava, exactly this point. So Rava says, by the way, when do the individuals have, right? So Reuven and Shimon and Levi were part of 3 different groups, right? Of 3, let's call it. Or 4, by the way. You could also make it a 4 if it makes you feel better, by the way. It doesn't have to be 3 groups of 3. It could even be 3 groups of 4, right? The idea just is that they're no longer part of that original mezumin. So if you even make it 4, everybody's happy. The groups could still bench, but now the idea is Reuven, Shimon, and Levi all came from 3 different groups. Now they come together, they bench with a mezumin. Now, comes along Rava. Rava says, that is only assuming that there was no benching in the first groups. Because watch this. Let's say, and this is an interesting case as well. Let's say Reuven, right? Reuven, Shimon, Levi, they're part of groups of 4, just to keep it easy, right? And now what happens? The groups begin to bench, b'mezumin. Reuven, Shimon, and Levi have to run out. They have to run out. So they don't bench with the group. Now they come together. So Rava says, if the mezumin was already done in their respective groups, then they don't have an ability to form another mezumin together. But if the mezumin was not yet formed in their previous respective groups, then they have the ability to go ahead and form a mezumin together. Interesting halacha. Amar Rava. So Rava says, "Minah from where do I know this? From where do I know this concept? It's actually very interesting. This nan mita shenignava chatzia osha avda chatzia osha chakua achin oshutvin tahora." Supposed to listen to this. If you have a bed. Now let's say someone stole half of the bed. Right? It's a bed made up of parts, interlocking parts. So half of it was sold, or half of it was lost, or better stated, ultimately again it was split, right? Or it was broken, whatever the mitzias is. So then what's the halacha? So the Gemara says, "Hechziruha mekabalas tuma mikana laba." So what's the halacha? The halacha is what says as follows. Let's say this bed was tamei. So the way it works is, if an item is tamei, if you deconstruct it and is no longer usable for its original use, usually it loses its tumah status. So now, if the bed is in a state of partial completion, right, as half a bed is not mekabel tumah. Not only that, but half a bed that was tamei loses its tumah once it's deconstructed. Let's say you put it back together. So if you return it, right, if you fix it, then ultimately, again, now it is mekabel tumah going forward. The Gemara says, "Mikana la'aba'in l'mafreya." Now it's only mekabel tumah ultimately going forward. But what doesn't happen? It doesn't reacquire its former tumah. What do you see from here? Alma kevan de palguha parach la tumah. What do you see from here? That since you essentially broke the bed in half, then ultimately again it is not mekabel tumah. So in other words, once you take something whole and you break it, it's no longer mekabel tumah. So what does that have to do with our sugya? So it says, "Hachanami kevan da'azmin alayu parach zima minaya." So in other words, what you see over here is as follows: when you have something that is a unit, once you break apart the unit, so the unit loses its identity. So too again, if Reuven, Shimon, and Levi are part of groups of 4, let's say, right? So now again, if they leave before their respective units did a mezuman, then ultimately again they could get together and make their own mezuman. But if halacha l'maisa, their groups did a mezuman while they were there, but Reuven and Shimon and Levi had to run out. They couldn't bench the group. They had to run out. Then halacha l'maisa, since the mezuman took place in their respective groups, that's it. There's no more mezuman for them. Obviously, they still have to bench. But should the 3 of them get together at a later time, halacha l'maisa, again, there is no zimun for them. Incredible. All right, well, so let's just do one more line, then we'll stop for tonight. So the Gemara says as follows: Beis chaburos. So remember, the Mishnah said if you have two groups that are going ahead and having a meal in one room or one area, if they see each other, then halacha l'maisa, again, they combine as a group. So the Gemara says, by the way, im yesh shamish beinehem, shamish mitzarfan. So the Gemara says something very interesting. There is one caveat to this. Let's say you have 2 groups in a room and they can't see each other, but the same waiter is taking care of the groups, so the waiter has the ability to bridge the groups together. So in other words, either you need visual connection or what we'll call service connection. So if there is one waiter attending to both groups, the waiter becomes the halachic bridge between the groups, and they could combine together to form a zumin. Elosai, shkoyach. All right, everyone's invited to Chassidus Chabura, special siyum Emir Hashem, to begin in just a few moments.